Welcome to Central Speaks, home of our weekly podcast. Central Speaks is produced by Hamilton Central Baptist Church.
Some crazy people love winter. Well, there is snuggling up next to the fire and plenty of rain on the roof. Others like summer, trips to the beach, barbecues, Christmas holidays. But I like spring. The cold days are getting warmer. Everything is showing little signs of green. There are blossoms on fruit trees, and maybe I like spring the best because a blossom is a sign that fruit is coming, and fruit is ripe and ready for eating when it is warmer and the colder days we have been experiencing are starting to get warmer. We know that the weather will soon be getting warmer because we can see the signs, and throughout our life we have experienced how the times change. And whatever seasons we are in now, there will soon be a new season, be it cold or hot, fruitful or seemingly fruitless. But what about our faith? Does our faith have seasons too? Maybe like me, you can remember when you first started out as a Christ follower. Everything was new and fresh, and we were aware of God's grace, so compelling, and His love, so obvious. Those precious first few years of being a young Christian. The worship songs I sang back then had such profound influence over my relationship with God. Every breath that I take, every moment I'm awake, Lord, have your way in me. I often look back to those times and long to be back there. But that was where I was many seasons ago. It was a season of fruitfulness and faithfulness, a time of God speaking, a time of careful listening. Do you ever consider what kind of season you are in? This week marks 6 months since we went into our first lockdown. For many of us, 2020 has been, quite frankly, a terrible year. Some of us had extra space to seek God. Others worked even harder, while others lost their jobs. Haven't we all been looking forward to a new season? A different season, where our plans will not be cancelled. A season of not being in lockdown. So what kind of season are you in? Are you longing for a better day? Are you wanting to go back to a better time? Maybe you are content with where you are right now. Things have never been better. After all, we are back in level 1. Today I want to look at how the various seasons we find ourselves in can be stepping stones that God uses to draw us closer to Him. Whether you are living in wonderful times of great hope or the testing times of great despair, God has not finished what He started. Let me pray. Dear Father of hope, beloved, understanding Son, and comforting Spirit, here amongst us, would you continue what you have started and draw us nearer to you today by your Spirit, in Jesus' name. I want to read a few pages from part of Israel's history found in 1 Kings. So to set the scene of chapter 17 and 18, we read in the preceding chapters how Israel's line of kings each carried on the sins of their fathers, until we get to the infamous King Ahab, who wins the prize for doing more evil than all those who went before him. Perhaps it's King Ahab's actions that led all of Israel into a season of drought. Ahab had set up an altar to Baal, the god who was meant to control the rain. But God was sending his prophet Elijah to show who was really in control, not just of the weather, but every season, including the one each of us are in right now. So let me read from chapter 17. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." The first thing I want to point out here is that Elijah set himself apart from King Ahab by pointing out which God he serves. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." Now, I don't know about you, but with food limits and social isolation, I wonder if Elijah could actually relate to being in lockdown. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Did you experience the feeling of going into survival mode? Preparing ourselves to eat rice and ration food and hoard toilet paper? Although it sounds rough for Elijah, with unclean animals preparing meat for him, did you catch God directed the ravens? And then we read, sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. That was not a good sign, and I am sure Elijah realized that he had a difficult season ahead of him. Maybe you have experienced when the bills keep coming and the work dries up. Or maybe the hunger keeps mounting, but the food dries up. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me please a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Now, this is what some people call divine provision. Do you ever feel battered, but know the storm is yet to hit? Friends, don't give up. This is just a season. The widow went away and did as Elijah told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse, and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Now we've got to remember, the widow had already come to terms with death. She and her son were planning to eat their last meal and die when Elijah first met her. The widow seems to have become accustomed to God's provision, but something was different now. "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on the bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." Did you notice Elijah had to ask more than once? Or maybe you noticed Elijah's question, Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow? Nobody can deny that the widow was faithful and trusted God for her and her son's survival. We could be tempted to even say she deserves to be looked after. Besides, she is the one looking after God's prophet Elijah. You know, we can be so quick to blame our sovereign God for what he allows in our hard seasons. Perhaps because we don't have the perspective of an all-knowing God. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, Look, your son is alive. Then the woman said to Elijah, Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. But why did God's divine and ongoing provision of oil and flour not convince the widow that Elijah really did speak God's truth? Surely that was a miracle. Here's the thing. Where we place our hope matters. It's often in our hardest seasons when we cry out to God for help. Very seldom do we express our heart's cry when we have become accustomed to God's provision. That is, until we realize all along that life is hopeless without Him. A widow, by definition, has already lost her husband. In losing her son, she understood the years of grief ahead of her, a hard season. My brother called me mid-January this year to tell me some terrible news. My 5-year-old nephew had been diagnosed with leukemia. Now, the good news is they caught it early, but they've definitely not had an easy run, as Theo's 5-year-old body has suffered with the potent chemo meds. They have discovered a helpful phrase. They have two options, bad and worse. Unfortunately, the bad option is actually the best option, but is still not good. And going into Auckland Hospital in the middle of a pandemic lockdown with a child who has a very limited immune system is gut-wrenching. Now maybe you have asked the famous question, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? But is that a question that is asked by people who have discovered the deep and authentic joys of hope and persevering faith that are formed in difficult and challenging times? Maybe you've heard somebody say they would be willing to go through a tough situation again because of the valuable lessons learned. Some people might call these tough seasons a drought, but they have learned the secret of the psalmist. In Psalm 43, we read, Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God. You see, the first thing we need to learn about hope is that it requires a choice. Even when life is terrible, we still have to choose where we put our hope. Perhaps a season of drought is helpful to show us where our true hope is and how shallow everything else is when we have placed our hope in other things. The church I grew up in as a child never sang hymns. In fact, it wasn't until I had decided to follow Jesus with my whole life and started attending a different church in a different city that I discovered songs that, although they were old, to me, they were new. I remember the first time I sang, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. There was a sense that this song was sung by Christ's first followers. I joined a men's gospel choir where I was half the age of the next youngest member, and I discovered a new world of singing and worship. But I also learned that the enjoyment of singing with others or the appreciation of the words had very little to do with worship or expressing how much I adored God. I also realized that some people do not like singing, and perhaps some are better equipped to give out bulletins instead of bung notes. Put simply, worship is the expression of worth towards the object of our adoration. So, worship is not singing, but it can be. Just like folding bulletins, serving coffee, choosing not to gossip, praying for others, giving tithes, and supporting the work of overseas mission. All of these, done out of adoration to God, is worship. Somehow I realized that I was really expressing worth to the songs, and not the one whom the songs were about. Now, if you are like me, you too may have a special song that you always go back to. You know them, the good old faithfuls. I have a few, and you may have a few too. Now, I don't have any issue with old songs, because we can treat new songs in exactly the same way too. The question is, are we being stretched forward into a new season, or do we keep looking back to an earlier, more comfortable time? As much as those moments were foundational in our relationship with God, He continues to work in our lives, and to do that, He allows for different seasons to help mold us. So I encourage you, don't resist the painful beauty of drought. The writer of the book of Hebrews tells us that God uses hardship to discipline His children. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as His children, for what children are not disciplined by their father? And later in verse 11 we read, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Remember, don't resist the painful beauty of drought. Make the most of the moment, however hard it is. Now, if you know the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, there is some spectacular stuff about to happen. But maybe I should stop now, kind of like giving up when the going gets tough. Consider Elijah, having been in isolation, a hated man by Israel's most hateful king, dependent on a poor widow, then blamed for the death of her only son. If you were in his place, could you have spotted the signs? Could you have known that you were about to restore a nation's relationship with God? 3 years pass and God tells Elijah to go and present himself to King Ahab. When King Ahab saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." Then all the people said, "What you say is good." Remember that Elijah had recently had a lesson on calling on the name of the Lord when he cried out for God to restore life to the widow's son. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. Since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. The prophets of Baal were doing everything they could to express worth towards their object of adoration, Baal, the one they believed would end the drought. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. That's about 15 litres. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. Now, if worship is the expression of worth towards the object of our adoration, and you want to understand how Elijah expressed his adoration of God, you need to understand the price he paid. What was God worth to Elijah? Well, in the middle of a drought, where brooks dried up 3 years ago, Elijah had 4 large jars of precious water carried up a mountain. And that's where he defied the law of pyromaniacs, who would be more inclined to pour petrol on a bonfire. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The fire that fell down from heaven destroyed the water, which the Baals believed came from their God. Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." When we read through Elijah's amazing story, it's easy to feel like only those superhero saints get to see those huge miracles. But the beauty of these chapters being read together shows us part of Elijah's journey between seasons. Just in case you thought Elijah had learned all there is to know about where to place hope, We read in the very next chapter how Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sends a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." And then we see his response. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Just like that, Elijah was in a new season, a season where God was teaching him new things and challenging with new challenges. But God was not finished with Elijah. When life is just terrible, we need to remind ourselves, like the psalmist, to put our hope in God. But when life is great, we must not forget where our hope comes from either. If we are following Jesus with the expectation that we will somehow earn our way out of suffering, then we're following the wrong guy. Jesus never promised his followers an easy life, but he did promise we would not be alone. Sin has moved us far away from the good garden in Genesis, but a good father gives good gifts. He prepares his children for what is most important, where we place our hope. We live in a malfunctioning world that chooses to live outside our manufacturer's specifications, but we are not dealing with a manufacturer of cold, hard whiteware. We are talking about a creator God who came and lived amongst us and suffered for us. We have an eternal warranty. We can be restored to factory settings. The repair costs have been covered. But to live how our Creator intended is to live within the purpose for what we were created. And that is to depend on Him. Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him and He will make your paths straight." Paul says, "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation." And what is that secret? It is Christ that gives him strength to do all things. Wherever you are, God is not finished with you. We who follow Christ are being sanctified, set apart, and just like Elijah set himself apart from those who put their hope in Baal, Christ followers place their hope in him. And in the process, we are made into his likeness, stretched, strengthened, maybe even softened. The Christian faith is by its very nature always looking forward with hope of Christ's return. And even though we can so often long for the days behind us or become complacent in the joy of what God is doing now, we will do well to recognize these seasons and let the Holy Spirit teach us to persevere in hope, keeping our eyes on the prize, even though we can feel so far from the finish line. Going through a spiritual drought is never easy in the moment, but often these moments are the ones that we look back to simply because we can see how God never left us. Being a Christ follower involves choices. We make sacrifices all the time on how much time we spend developing our relationship with God and His people, what we choose to watch on Netflix. We choose to make time to attend church, be it physically or virtually. We choose to volunteer with church initiatives like the Spring Clean, even though our homes might need a clean. We choose to talk to new people, even though it may feel awkward. We make space for others. Some of us give up their Thursday night to practice and be a part of the music team. Others come in on Friday mornings to keep the building in good repair. Others come in early and leave late to set up for special events. And most of you will do things that nobody else sees. But they too are expressions of worth and adoration to God. But let's move forward, knowing He never leaves us. Let's learn the depths of God's love and power that are foreign in a rich, complacent nation like New Zealand. Whatever season you are in, let's keep expressing to God what He is worth to us. If God allows hardship, He will also provide all our needs. But we may have to learn how to trust Him with our last bit of flour and oil. If God allows rejection and loneliness, He will also allow us to see Him as our closest friend. If God allows tiredness and weakness, He will let us learn dependence on Him. If God allows sickness, He will let us learn to trust Him. And if God allows even death, He promises life eternal for those who trust Him. We can come out of lockdown unchanged, or we can choose to trust God not only in this season, but all those that follow.
Thanks for joining us this week online. Come join us on Sunday mornings too if you're in Hamilton. Find out more about Hamilton Central Baptist Church and discover ways to get involved at www.hcbc.nz. Join us again next week at Central Speaks.